The warm, heavy air of a Tennessee summer evening lay thick over the sprawling Patterson estate, a century-old mansion tucked behind towering oak trees and hedgerows, trimmed with the same obsessive precision that marked every inch of the property. It was 2001, and Nashville was booming new money flowing into old neighborhoods, the scent of barbecue mixing with diesel from construction trucks on every road. But the Patterson house seemed frozen in time, an island of old Southern wealth, insulated from the chaos beyond its iron gates. On that particular evening, the main kitchen bustled with staff in white aprons, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and sizzling butter. Claire Morton, the Pattersons' private chef, wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, surveying the rack of prime ribs slowly roasting in the cavernous oven, the timer ticking like a metronome in her head. She had been in charge of dozens of dinners before, but tonight felt different, and she could not explain why. She moved with automatic precision from counter to stove to sync her thoughts only occasionally flickering to the conversation she had overheard earlier between Mr. and Mrs. Patterson in the study. She could still see the narrow set of Mrs. Patterson's mouth, the way she avoided her husband's eyes, the way he snapped his newspaper shut in a single angry motion. The entire house felt on edge like a bow pulled too tight. But Claire was not paid to ask questions. She was paid to produce perfect meals, to smile politely at the guests when summoned, and to pretend the undercurrents swirling through the house were not her concern. Outside, the cicadas were screaming in the dusk, their cries rising and falling like the sound of a distant alarm. She shook her head, pressing her fingers into her temples, and returned to the chopping board. It was somewhere between prepping the béarnaise sauce and plating the roasted asparagus that Claire realized the kitchen had fallen silent behind her. She turned, expecting to see the sous chef fiddling with the industrial dishwasher or polishing silverware, but there was no one. The back door was ajar, the screen creaking in the breeze. She set down her knife carefully, the handle sticky with butter and sweat. The house seemed to breathe around her old floorboards, shifting the refrigerator humming like some strange machine in a lab. For a moment she felt a strange surge of vertigo, as if the world had tilted slightly and she was the only one who noticed. She called out to no one in particular, her voice swallowed by the cavernous kitchen, but no answer came. Stepping forward, she wiped her palms on her apron, eyes scanning the door. Beyond it lay the service tunnel, an old brick-lined corridor that led to the delivery lot behind the garage. No one used it anymore, at least not in any official capacity. She remembered hearing one of the older maids mutter about it being haunted, a dark joke tossed off over laundry folding and hushed laughter. Claire had never given the superstition much thought. But tonight the door yawned open like a throat, the shadows inside thick and still. She frowned, leaning closer, the smell of old earth and damp concrete drifting out. A shiver crawled across her shoulders. She glanced back at the stove, where the sauce bubbled unattended. But something compelled her to lean just a little further, to squint into the darkness. That was the last time anyone saw Claire Morton. When the clock on the wall chimed 7, the sous chef returned from the pantry to find the kitchen in chaos. Flames licked at the edge of the saucepan, the oven timer shrieking into the empty room. The countertop was littered with half-prepared dishes, herbs wilting in the heat. Claire's knife lay exactly where she had set it, balanced precariously on the edge of the cutting board. The door to the service tunnel swung gently on its old hinges, creaking as the wind swept through the corridor. The staff searched the grounds in mounting panic, voices cracking with fear and disbelief. The mansion became a hive of activity. Security guards called in from their posts at the gates, cell phones chirping and beeping in sweaty palms. The Patterson family did not appreciate scenes. Within an hour, Mrs. Patterson emerged from her bedroom in a dressing gown, face pale, but expression icy. She ordered the staff to search the property again and to keep the gates closed. She refused to call the police immediately, insisting Claire must have had some personal crisis, some drama she wished to stage. Mr. Patterson, hair slicked back and teeth bared in what might have been intended as a smile, told the remaining dinner guests that the meal would be delayed, but that there was no cause for alarm. The other staff huddled in the mudroom, whispering fiercely. They spoke of debts. Claire might have had an affair with someone in the family, or worse. No one really knew. By the time the police finally arrived, the estate had settled into a strange hush. The hedges rustled in the night breeze. The fountain burbled cheerfully in the dark. The official investigation began awkwardly. Uniformed officers trod the manicured grounds, their boots sinking into the thick, overwatered grass. They questioned the staff, took statements from the family in the drawing room, with its gilded ceiling and ancestral portraits, and combed through the massive kitchen, where the meal had been abandoned in chaos. Dogs were brought in from the county sheriff's department, their handlers issuing crisp commands, leashes taut. But the dogs lost Claire's scent near the service tunnel exit behind the garage, where the gravel lot sloped into a tangle of neglected hedges and wild muscadine vines. No sign of struggle, no torn clothing, no footprints in the damp earth beyond. It was as if Claire had simply evaporated, leaving only the smell of butter and rosemary lingering in the air. The Patterson family cooperated at first in their own brittle way. They offered the police access to the grounds, but resisted a full search of their personal suites. They insisted on their privacy, on decorum. Mrs. Patterson wore black to her first interview with the detectives, claiming to be in mourning for the loss of someone she considered family, though she could not quite remember Claire's birthday or middle name. Mr. Patterson smiled for the cameras when the local news came to film, offering platitudes about prayers and community support, while the police tape fluttered behind him. But beneath the surface, the household bristled with tension accusations and half-whispered fears. By the time the sun rose over the estate the next morning, the entire city of Nashville was talking about the missing chef, the rumors swirling like cigarette smoke in the humid air. The first stage of the story ends here, a portrait of a southern estate frozen in a moment of crisis. The viewer on YouTube is left with an image of a knife left on a board, a sauce boiling over a door swinging open to a dark tunnel, and a woman who stepped through it and vanished without a trace. The hush in the grand old house is thick with unspoken truths and muffled sobs, the staff still awake into the dawn light, waiting for someone to tell them what happens next. The days following Claire Morton's disappearance were marked by a sticky heat that refused to break, pressing down on Nashville like a punishment no one deserved. The Patterson estate became a strange sort of museum piece, crawling with uniformed officers who tried to look professional, while sweat darkened their collars. They walked through the rooms one by one, notebooks in hand, their questions repetitive and uncomfortably personal. The staff began to show cracks under the weight of suspicion. The butler avoided eye contact. The gardener was found in tears behind the tool shed, insisting he knew nothing. The housekeeper went home one evening and never came back, sending word by her sister that she would not step foot in that house again. By the end of the week, the police chief himself arrived in his pressed blue shirt and took a turn through the marble foyer, offering condolences while making it clear that the family needed to allow a more thorough search. Mrs. Patterson watched him with calm, unreadable eyes. She sat in the formal parlor, its heavy curtains drawn against the noon sun porcelain teacup balanced in gloved hands. She listened politely to every question. Her answers were impeccable. She had no idea why Claire would run off, no idea what problems she might have had. She spoke of her staff in glowing terms, while quietly referring to Claire's supposed mood swings and vague family troubles she could not quite describe. Mr. Patterson remained in his study door, closed a glass of bourbon, sweating onto the desk blotter. When asked for comment, he replied in a voice that carried through the thick walls that the investigation was disrupting his business calls and his family's peace. A detective tried to lean on him, speaking of subpoenas, but the lawyer hired that same afternoon sent letters citing privacy harassment and the family's right to grieve in peace. The search outside was equally frustrating. The service tunnel had been a curiosity for years, lined with bricks darkened by age and neglect, its entrance behind the garage like an afterthought from a bygone era. Officers walked it end to end with flashlights, their beams catching old cobwebs, muddy footprints that could have been anyone's, and a scent of mildew that made them cough. There was no sign of blood or torn clothing. The dogs that had picked up her scent lost it completely at the door leading to the back lot. Beyond that, only the scrubby grass and an unpaved track leading into the woods offered any hope, but there were no clear footprints. The heat dried everything too quickly. Rumors began to swirl that she had gotten into a car, though whose car was anyone's guess. For a time, the media swarmed the gates. Local reporters stood on the road in the sticky twilight, their camera lights casting ghoulish shadows on their faces as they delivered updates that grew thinner by the day. Interviews with neighbors added fuel to the gossip. Some said they heard shouting the night Claire disappeared. Others claimed she had been having a relationship with Mr. Patterson, a story that delighted the tabloids but could not be verified. Police records showed no prior complaints, no restraining orders. Nothing to hint at violence or fear. Old friends of Claire came forward to speak of her kindness, her dry humor, the long hours she worked to send money to her brother in college. But they admitted she could be stubborn private about her personal life, reluctant to share anything that might embarrass her. The investigation found no diaries, no letters, no emails that revealed any plan to run. By the third week, the search had lost its urgency. The police presence dwindled to a single squad car at the gate, in the evenings more for show than anything else. The detectives rotated off the case, their folders fat with statements, receipts, witness logs, and maps of the property. The official language shifted to possible voluntary disappearance, though the word foul play hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The Patterson family made a quiet donation to the local police fund and left for Europe shortly after citing stress and a need to be with extended family. Their lawyers kept up a trickle of communication enough to appear cooperative without offering anything new. Back in Nashville, the story lost its front-page position, dropping into the background noise of other tragedies and scandals. Behind the scenes, there were whispers that the investigation had been mishandled. Some officers complained that they had not been allowed to search the entire house, that certain rooms were off-limits. Others insisted there was no evidence of a crime at all, just a woman who had walked away from her life for reasons no one could understand. There was talk of missing security camera footage from the garage, a hard drive that had been wiped after a power surge. No one could prove anything, and the department was under pressure to move on. Even the most dedicated detectives eventually closed their notebooks and turned to the next call. Claire's name faded from their daily briefings, replaced by burglaries, drug busts, and the slow grind of violent crime in a growing city. The staff at the estate found other work. Some refused to speak of what they had seen or heard, while others sold their stories to gossip columns for a few $100s. They spoke of tension in the family-hushed arguments in hallways, unexpected late-night visitors who never signed the logbook. One former maid claimed she saw Mrs. Patterson burning papers in the old fireplace the morning after Claire vanished, though she later recanted, saying she could not be sure. The local papers stopped running the story, except for the occasional anniversary piece with her smiling portrait, her name under bold letters asking Nashville to remember. But the memory of the Patterson mansion, its dark service tunnel, and the woman who stepped through it and never came back, lingered in the city's collective imagination. After the Pattersons departed for Europe, the grand old house stood locked behind its gates, the driveway slowly filling with fallen leaves, and the fountain going dry in the relentless Tennessee heat. Without the family in residence, the house lost its careful polish. Weeds began to creep up the marble steps. Dust gathered on the stained glass windows, dulling the colors that once cast cheerful patterns on the foyer floor. The caretaker came by once a week to check for mail, adjust the thermostat, and ensure the place did not look abandoned to the neighbors. But he did little else because he was instructed to do only that. He did not answer questions from reporters who still showed up occasionally, standing at the fence with their cameras hoping for one last quote. When asked about Claire, he would shake his head and say he did not know anything, that the family had given no instructions beyond maintaining the property. Inside, the rooms remained frozen in time. The kitchen had been cleaned, of course, but the memory of that night hung in the air like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. The old chopping block was gone, replaced with a new slab of wood that smelled of fresh varnish. But the staff who had worked there before remembered the original one, with its deep grooves and cuts, the history of 1,000 meals prepared with care. They remembered the shrieking oven timer, the half-prepared dishes left to spoil the single knife left behind on the counter. The security system was updated that year, but it did not replace the footage that had been lost. No one had a satisfactory explanation for that power surge, though the electrician the family hired insisted it was common in houses of that age. Neighbors avoided talking about the house if they could help it. When forced, they would say only that it seemed wrong for it to stand empty, that such a fine old home deserved a family to fill it with laughter. But their voices would drop when they spoke of Claire. Some remembered her walking through the gates on grocery days, smiling politely, and refusing help with her heavy bags. Others had never noticed her at all. That perhaps was the tragedy in its purest form. She had been someone easy to overlook, even as she served carefully plated meals to some of the wealthiest people in Nashville. When the mail piled up too high, the caretaker would collect it all in silence, stuffing bills and glossy European postcards into a locked drawer no one else had the key to open. The Pattersons sent letters occasionally to their lawyer, instructing him on property taxes, insurance payments, and small repairs. But they offered no instructions about Claire. They never issued a formal statement about the investigation beyond one early press release expressing sorrow for her family and hopes that she was safe somewhere. That statement was reprinted every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, the same words in the same order. Reporters would call the lawyer for comment, and he would decline politely but firmly. When asked if the family planned to return, he would only say that they had no immediate plans to do so. It was clear that the mansion had become something they did not want to face, a relic of a chapter they had decided to close, even if the rest of the city had not. Meanwhile, Claire's own family tried to hold on to hope. Her younger brother, who had been in college at the time she vanished, dropped out for a year after she disappeared. He spent that time talking to police, chasing rumors, fighting with reporters who misquoted him, and begging for meetings with lawyers who would not see him. He had no money to hire private investigators of his own, no legal expertise to force the family to open their records or release the security footage they claimed had been erased. Eventually, he returned to school on a scholarship, quiet and withdrawn. He carried her picture in his wallet, a sun-faded photograph of Claire, smiling in front of a Christmas tree, eyes crinkled with laughter. What disturbed him most were the bank deposits. Starting the Christmas, after Claire vanished, his checking account began to receive small, anonymous deposits. $100 the first year, then $500, then $1,000. By 2008, he had received more than $30,000 in total. He reported it to the police, who could do nothing. The bank claimed the deposits were cash made at distant ATMs that could not provide clear camera footage. No one ever claimed responsibility. When asked what he thought, he would only shake his head and say he did not know. Sometimes he said he hoped it was Claire herself sending what she could, proof that she was alive somewhere. Other times he admitted it felt like blood money, hush money designed to keep him quiet. He stopped speaking to reporters after a local paper ran a headline calling it a payout. The city of Nashville moved on in its slow southern way. New money continued to pour in. Grand old homes were renovated, sold, or torn down. The Patterson mansion remained untouched behind its high gates, a ghost on a street otherwise lined with signs of prosperity. Children whispered about it when they rode their bikes past, daring each other to touch the rusted gate. Teenagers told stories at bonfires, about the haunted kitchen, about the woman who cooked her last meal and walked through a door that swallowed her whole. But for most people, Claire Morton became little more than a name on old police bulletins and faded newspaper clippings. Another mystery that no one seemed in a hurry to solve. 7 years passed with an indifferent sort of cruelty as the Patterson mansion sat in silence behind its rusted gate, waiting for something that never seemed to come. The grand columns stained with rain streaks looked out over a street that had changed without it. Across town, Nashville transformed with new restaurants and shiny condo developments that claimed old neighborhoods one block at a time. But on that quiet stretch of the road, the house felt trapped in the past. The rumor that Claire Morton had been involved with Mr. Patterson gained traction because it was simple and salacious. It fit neatly into the story that people wanted to tell themselves about old money-hidden affairs and the dark price of privilege. People at the grocery store whispered that she had threatened to tell Mrs. Patterson everything that she had been caught in a compromising moment in the kitchen. Others suggested she had been paid to leave quietly, and something had gone wrong. These stories took on a life of their own because no one could prove or disprove them. Even the police, when asked for comment, would only shrug. They had no leads, no evidence of foul play, no body to bury or to mourn properly. The neighbors filled the silence with gossip, drawing on old Southern traditions of storytelling that blurred fact and suspicion until they could no longer be separated. Everyone had a version of the truth, and each version condemned someone new. Meanwhile, Claire's brother tried to live a normal life. He graduated, found a job in a bank, wore a tie to work every morning, and tried to put together a future that did not involve searching for his sister. But every December, he found another anonymous deposit in his account. The bank told him they could do nothing to trace them. The police, embarrassed by the cold case, stopped returning his calls after a while. He wondered every year if it was Claire herself forced into hiding somewhere, trying to tell him she was alive. He spent sleepless nights picturing her in another state, another country, working in a diner under a false name, waiting for a chance to come home. Or he would think darker thoughts, imagining that someone was paying to soothe his anger, to keep him quiet about things he could not prove. In that time, the Patterson family's reputation changed in quiet, subtle ways. They remained abroad, sending instructions through lawyers, paying taxes on the empty property, ensuring the gates were locked and the cameras kept running. But in Nashville society, they lost their luster. The invitations stopped coming for the charity balls they used to sponsor. The local women who had once visited for tea found reasons to decline. The whispers grew even among their own friends, people who would never admit to believing the worst, but who avoided mentioning the family name in polite conversation. Their absence only fed the stories. Without them to deny anything, the city was free to believe the worst. The mansion itself became a magnet for curiosity seekers. Teenagers dared each other to approach the gate at night, to slip between the bars, and stand on the cracked path. They told ghost stories about Claire Morton wandering the halls, knife in hand, eyes wide with terror. Urban explorers sometimes bragged online about breaking in, posting blurry photos of grand staircases choked with dust parlors filled with sheet-draped furniture and the infamous kitchen where the door to the service tunnel stood slightly ajar. They claimed the air smelled wrong in that room, like stale blood and cold earth. Police occasionally chased them off, but the city was large and resources thin. The house remained an irresistible challenge, its silence a dare that few could resist. What the trespassers did not see were the letters the family still sent to the caretaker, instructing him to keep the grounds just so. They wanted it to look inhabited enough to deter squatters, but not so inviting that anyone would think they might return. The caretaker did what he was paid to do. He fixed broken windows, kept the locks in working order, and chased away the most persistent of the vandals. But even he admitted privately that the house felt wrong to him. He refused to go inside alone after sunset. He told his wife it was because he was old and the stairs were dangerous in the dark, but she suspected he simply did not like the way the walls seemed to listen. For the police, the case was a burden they could not quite put down. Every time a new detective took over the district, he or she would review the file. The old photos showed a smiling young woman with a white apron tied neatly around her waist face, lit with pride at the kitchen she ran so well. The notes detailed the night she disappeared in bureaucratic language drained of life. Each detective made the same calls, found the same uncooperative lawyers, and received the same cold silence from the family overseas. After a few months, each detective put the file back on the shelf and turned to crimes they could actually solve. Over time, the folder grew thicker with notes and thinner with hope. When the Patterson family finally decided to sell the mansion in 2008, it was less a grand announcement than a quiet transaction handled through lawyers and brokers who specialized in such things. The sale went to a local developer who saw the potential in restoring an architectural landmark that had sat empty too long. The house had good bones, as the real estate agent liked to say, solid brick walls and historic details that could be marketed to the right kind of buyer. Crews arrived in the spring, men in dusty jeans, unloading ladders and plywood, their voices echoing off the long, empty driveway. They brought with them the smell of fresh paint and coffee in battered thermoses, the sound of hammers and saws filling the halls that had been silent for years. For the first time in almost a decade, there was life in the old house again. The kitchen was a particular focus. Buyers loved big open kitchens, the developer said. He wanted to keep the old charm, but update the appliances and layout. Workers ripped out the heavy marble counters, the old sink with its rust-stained edges, the ancient double ovens that had once turned out grand meals for Nashville's social elite. They pried up the cracked tile and stripped the walls back to plaster. In doing so, they uncovered things no one expected. Behind the butler's pantry, where generations of staff had once stored silverware and linen napkins, they found a strange seam in the wall. It was a hairline crack at first, nearly invisible beneath layers of old paint and wallpaper, but once spotted it was impossible to ignore. Curious, and a little spooked, the foreman instructed his crew to investigate. They chipped away carefully at the plaster, revealing a narrow panel, old wood dry as bone. It was not part of any blueprint the developer had been given, though older staff who remembered the house whispered there had always been talk of hidden compartments. When they finally got the panel loose, it fell forward with a reluctant groan, scattering dust and mouse droppings. What they found behind it was not treasure or valuables, but something that felt far more intimate and unsettling. There, resting in the shadows, was an old leather wallet, dried and cracked with age. Inside was a state ID for Claire Morton. The photo faded, but unmistakable. The men went quiet when they realized what they were holding. The ID was not alone. Tucked beside it was a folded grocery list written in looping, careful script on a piece of lined paper. The date at the top matched the night she had vanished. The items were unremarkable things any cook might need for dinner service, but the implications chilled everyone who saw it. They handed it over to the site manager, who called the police. When the squad car rolled up the cracked driveway that afternoon, the workers stood smoking in a loose circle on the lawn, avoiding each other's eyes. The detective on duty took the evidence bag, gingerly, his face unreadable. It had been years since anyone expected progress on the case, but here it was handed to them by a crowbar and a contractor with no idea what he was really tearing down. News spread quickly, as it always does, in towns where old money and old scandals are cherished like family heirlooms. The newspaper ran the story with grim relish. Renovation uncovers clue in long, cold missing persons case. Claire's brother received the call at work and left without saying a word to anyone driving 6 hours to Nashville in a haze of memory and dread. He met with the detectives in the same downtown station where he had filed the missing persons report all those years before. The room felt smaller this time, the fluorescent lights harsher. They laid the ID and grocery list on the table between them like offerings to a god that never answered prayers. He stared at them for a long time, fingers curling into fists against his knees, and asked them what it meant. The detectives could not say. They had theories, of course. Perhaps she had hidden there herself, though why she would abandon her ID was a mystery. Perhaps someone had forced her into the compartment, a temporary prison that had never been discovered until now. But the space was small, barely enough for a person to crouch. It seemed impossible anyone could have stayed there long without being found. The lack of blood or human remains complicated everything. The grocery list was the worst part for her brother. It was so normal, so painfully mundane proof she had been planning to finish her night to cook a meal to go on with her life. He left the station that evening without answering any more questions, the bagged evidence a cruel reminder of hope deferred. The police reopened the file, though they did so quietly, wary of admitting how cold it had grown. They returned to the mansion to examine the other walls, the floors, the service tunnel with its damp smell of mold and earth. Crime scene tape fluttered in the summer wind for the first time in years, attracting curious neighbors who had almost forgotten why they whispered about the place. Officers and contractors picked through the plaster, the insulation, the crawl spaces with measured frustration. They found nothing more. It was as if the house had offered up its single secret and refused to yield anything else. The new owner threatened to sue for damages and lost time, but the investigation had to run its course. Claire's ID sat in an evidence locker, the photo of her careful smile, staring at no one. The mansion seemed different after the discovery, as if the walls themselves had started whispering secrets no one had been ready to hear. Police cars came and went from the property for weeks. Neighbors slowed their cars to watch uniformed officers with clipboards walk the perimeter over and over, as though repetition might conjure answers from the empty windows. Investigators focused on the hidden panel and everything it implied. Forensics technicians set up lights in the kitchen, taking photographs of the cavity where the ID had rested in the dark for 7 years. When they examined the panel more closely, they saw something strange that had escaped notice in the first rush of curiosity. There were scuffs along the bottom edge, tiny marks that suggested a woman's heel had pressed hard against the wood. The detective in charge traced the scratches with gloved fingertips, the fine hairs on his neck rising in the stale air. Blueprints of the original house were pulled from city records and laid out on the scuffed table in the police conference room. The plans dated back nearly 100 years, stained with coffee rings and fragile along the folds. The detective studied them late into the night, comparing every wall, every door, every corridor to the modern layout. According to the blueprints, the butler's pantry did not include a compartment or latch of any kind. It should have been solid brick, but a later set of plans from the 1970s showed renovations that added storage for fine china and wine. No permit listed a hidden space. No contractor could be identified who might have built it. The absence of official records felt deliberate, and the detective marked the change in bold red ink, circling it twice. When the renovation crews were finally allowed to return, they did so under the careful eye of the police. The workers took down more paneling in the kitchen and dining room, chipping away plaster and old insulation. No one found another hidden cavity. No lost belongings, no trace of blood. The forensics team turned their attention to the service tunnel, where Claire's scent had last been tracked by search dogs. Over the years, the tunnel had grown even more damp and unpleasant, the smell of mildew clinging to the brick like a warning. When they swept ultraviolet lights across the rough floor, they found flecks of something that glowed faintly along the seam, where the tunnel met the back steps. Swabs were taken and sent to the lab. The detective stood at the threshold, breathing through his mouth as he studied the uneven bricks. Days later, the results came back. The glowing residue tested positive for trace amounts of human blood. Further analysis confirmed it belonged to Claire Morton. The revelation changed the entire tone of the investigation. What had once been a missing persons case officially shifted into a likely homicide. The press returned with cameras and microphones, their headlines broadcasting the grisly confirmation. Claire's brother received the news by phone, his voice raw when he called the detective to ask if this meant she was dead. The detective could only say it proved she was injured there, nothing more. No body had been found. No weapon was recovered. Without more evidence, no charges could be filed. The absence felt as suffocating as it had on the first day she vanished. The city found itself pulled back into speculation. The same talk shows that had pounced on rumors years earlier invited guests to rehash every theory. They replayed the old footage of the Patterson family standing on their front steps, the father's arm looped stiffly around his wife's shoulders. Lawyers issued statements on their behalf, emphasizing how they had always cooperated. They offered no comment on whether they would return to Tennessee. Privately, investigators debated whether to press for search warrants on the family's properties overseas. But the legal process was slow, and the evidence, though compelling, was still circumstantial. Without a body, without a witness, prosecutors warned that a trial could collapse under cross-examination. For Claire's brother, the renewed attention felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. He drove to the house one afternoon, parking behind the line of reporters who waited at the gate. He stood in the shadow of the old magnolia trees, hands jammed in his pockets, and tried to imagine his sister stepping through the kitchen door for the last time. He could picture her carrying a tray of spices or a basket of fresh herbs, her mind occupied with the 1,000 small details of dinner service. He wondered if she had known something was wrong, if she had sensed danger. The thought haunted him as he turned away from the gate, the cameras flashing in the fading light behind him. The Patterson family could no longer hide in Europe when the discovery of Claire Morton's ID and bloodstain hit the local news. Despite their carefully managed silence for years, the new evidence forced them into the uncomfortable glare of public suspicion. Their attorney issued a stiff press release from London, repeating condolences to Claire's family and stating they were cooperating with authorities. But the words felt hollow to Nashville residents who remembered the family's abrupt departure after the investigation stalled. Talk radio hosts and local papers dissected every sentence of the release, drawing out its cold, legalistic tone as proof that the Pattersons cared only about avoiding blame. The city that had once feted them at charity galas now spoke their name with contempt, using them as an example of how wealth could bury the truth for a time, but not forever. Mrs. Dees Patterson was said to be living in a townhouse in Kensington, occasionally photographed by gossip sites as she shopped at luxury boutiques with an assistant trailing behind her. Comment sections on these photos turned savage, filled with accusations that she was enjoying her freedom while Claire's family mourned. Mr. Patterson, by contrast, had retreated even further. He conducted business over the phone from a villa in the south of France, refusing interviews, sending all questions through lawyers. Their son, now a man in his 20s, rarely appeared in public at all, dogged by reporters who wanted his thoughts on the discovery. He offered none. Rumors spread that the family was fighting internally, disagreeing over whether to return to Tennessee to clear their name or stay away to avoid prosecution. Back in Nashville, the police felt pressure from every side. Politicians demanded answers to satisfy an angry public. Detectives were pulled from other cases to work the reopened file. Officers who had once shrugged at the cold case found themselves ordered to dig deeper than ever. They interviewed former staff members who had left town years earlier, tracking them to new jobs in Georgia, Kentucky, and Alabama. Some were willing to talk, sharing stories of late-night arguments, hurried changes to staff schedules, and the way Mrs. Patterson once insisted the kitchen be scrubbed at 3 a.m. after Claire vanished. Others refused to speak at all, fearful of being sued, or simply tired of living in the shadow of that grand, decaying house on Belle Meade Boulevard. Claire's brother watched this renewed frenzy with a mix of anger and fragile hope. For years he had begged anyone who would listen to keep the investigation alive. Now the same people who ignored him were demanding interviews. He gave a single statement on the courthouse steps, his voice shaking as he thanked the police for continuing to search for the truth. He asked for privacy after that, refusing further requests. Friends who knew him well said he spent his nights sifting through old photographs of Claire, looking for signs of fear in her eyes that he had missed. He still received the annual bank deposits. He asked the police to trace them again, but the trail ended as it always had at anonymous cash deposits in distant states. The money remained untouched in his account, proof of guilt he could not prove. As investigators scoured the mansion one final time before handing it back to the new owner, they turned over every floorboard and pried at every hidden panel. They found no human remains, no murder weapon, no definitive evidence of who had put the blood in the service tunnel or Claire's ID behind the hidden wall. The grand old house seemed almost smug in its refusal to offer any more secrets. But the damage was done. The discovery of the ID and blood had changed the narrative forever. This was no longer a story about a cook who walked off the job or ran away to start a new life. It was a crime scene, a cold case upgraded to a probable murder. Local media kept the story alive with daily updates. They pored over property records, publishing photos of the Patterson family's European residences with captions that felt like accusations. They interviewed legal experts about extradition, though no formal charges had been filed. They speculated about the cost of potential trials, the risk of losing in court without a body. The police chief held press conferences where he promised to pursue every lead. He stopped short of naming suspects, but everyone knew who he meant. He did not have to say the family's name for the public to understand. The Patterson mansion, with its cracked marble floors and grand staircase layered in dust, had become a crime scene in all but official designation. When the forensic team returned one last time before closing the investigation for lack of hard evidence, they were determined to document every detail that might have been missed. One investigator focused on the wine cellar, a shadowy space that had always felt like an afterthought to the house's grand design. The cool air and stone walls made it the perfect storage for expensive bottles, many long gone with the family's departure. As the investigator brushed aside cobwebs, he noticed a faint seam in the brickwork. It looked like nothing at first, but careful pressure revealed it to be a disguised panel that creaked open with effort. Inside was a shallow cavity containing a box coated in dust and mildew. When they pried it open, they found old ledgers, the pages crumbling but legible, full of handwritten numbers and dates. The ledgers went back decades with the neat, deliberate handwriting of someone accustomed to secrecy. The older entries detailed cash purchases for renovations and imported luxuries that might have been easily explained. But the later pages were worse, showing massive cash withdrawals, unreported income, and names that linked to shell companies with no apparent services. There were dates that lined up with the year Claire had started working at the house, the pages abruptly stopping around the month she disappeared. The implications were clear. Claire might have found these records, or someone suspected she had. The discovery reignited a fire in the detectives, who had grown numb to the case's dead ends. They copied every page, sealed the originals in evidence bags, and sent them to the Financial Crimes Unit, hoping they might finally answer the question of why a woman would vanish from her job without a trace. Lawyers for the Patterson family reacted predictably. They claimed no knowledge of the ledgers, denied any wrongdoing, and dismissed the idea that the family would have any reason to harm an employee over missing money. But the ledger pages told a story they could not easily explain. The investigators went public, holding up photocopies during a tense press conference. Reporters leaned forward with hungry expressions as the lead detective explained how the missing pages coincided with Claire Morton's final weeks. Even without her testimony, even without a body, the ledger painted a picture of a household in panic over exposure. The detective's voice was calm, but the weight of accusation was unmistakable. As the news spread, Nashville erupted with speculation. Talk shows filled with outraged voices condemned the Pattersons as criminals who had bribed their way to safety for years. Columnists wrote scathing editorials about the city's complicity, noting how the family's donations to local charities had silenced questions for too long. Even former friends began to distance themselves publicly. Old social ties frayed and snapped, leaving the family marooned in their European exile. Reporters camped outside their London townhouse and their villa in France, shouting questions about the ledgers, about Claire, about blood on the tunnel floor. They got nothing in return but slammed doors and silence. For Claire's brother, the discovery brought no relief, only more hollow pain. He spent nights at the kitchen table with printouts of the ledger pages spread before him, tracing every dollar, every date, trying to understand what had happened. He imagined Claire finding these same pages, mouth-tightening in anger, as she realized how much the family had hidden. He pictured her confronting them, refusing hush money, determined to do the right thing, even as fear made her voice shake. The images haunted him because they were all he had left of her. There was no grave to visit, no final words to remember. Just this paper trail, a map of greed that led nowhere but to the empty space where she used to stand. Prosecutors reviewed the case, their offices filled with heated debate about whether to press charges. Some argued the ledgers were clear proof of motive, that it was enough to force the family back to the United States. Others warned it would never hold up in court without a body or an eyewitness. Claire's brother sat in on some of those meetings, trying to keep his rage in check, as lawyers spoke clinically about burden of proof and jury sympathy. He wanted to scream at them that his sister had died for this money, that someone had dragged her through that tunnel and left her blood on the floor. But he knew that rage meant nothing to the law. The public was less restrained. Online forums filled with theories and demands for justice. Locals posted photos of the mansion's gates with mocking captions calling it Nashville's biggest crime scene. True crime podcasts launched special series on Claire Morton, reconstructing her last day in excruciating detail. Hosts speculated wildly about who in the family had given the order, who had paid off the right people who still had blood on their hands. For many, the ledgers were all the proof they needed. The court of public opinion delivered its verdict in loud, angry consensus. The public pressure on the Patterson family grew unbearable after the ledgers were revealed. The attorney who had served them faithfully for years resigned quietly, citing health concerns, though everyone in Nashville guessed the real reason. Journalists tracked the family's every move in Europe, publishing photos of Mrs. Patterson exiting a lawyer's office with her face drawn and pale. Rumors swirled that she had fired her husband's advisors and hired her own legal team. Back in Tennessee, prosecutors sensed a crack forming in the family's united front. They reached out through intermediaries with an offer suggesting that cooperation could prevent the worst outcome for anyone willing to talk. It was a strategy born of frustration as well as hope. Mrs. Patterson finally agreed to a private meeting in London with 2 American investigators and her lawyer at her side. The room was small and spare, a rented conference space with stale coffee and fluorescent lights. She sat upright in her chair, fingers laced tightly in her lap. The once confident hostess reduced to a rigid figure whose voice trembled only slightly. She admitted that she had known about the hidden ledger. She said she discovered the secret records only after Claire's disappearance, claimed she had confronted her husband about them in private. But when asked why she never told police, her voice faltered. She said she feared what the truth would mean for her family, for her son, for their reputation that had already begun to crumble even before Claire went missing. The detectives pressed her, reminding her she was not on trial yet, but that lying would end negotiations. Slowly, with repeated sighs and long silences, Mrs. Patterson began to speak more freely. She described the night Claire vanished. She said there had been an argument in the kitchen, that Claire had threatened to go to the authorities with what she found. Mrs. Patterson claimed she tried to calm her down, to offer more money if she would stay silent, but Claire refused. She called the Pattersons liars and thieves. At this point, Mrs. Patterson's voice caught, and she wiped her eyes before going on. She described Mr. Patterson's reaction as explosive, said he shouted at Claire, accused her of betrayal, that he lunged at her, knocking her against the counter. She insisted she tried to stop him, but that everything happened too quickly. When asked what happened next, Mrs. Patterson grew evasive again. She said Claire fell hard, struck her head on the corner of the prep table. She claimed there was blood, that Claire lay still. But then she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. She said she left the room to find her son, who had been upstairs. When she returned, she claimed Claire was gone. The blood had been wiped away, the body removed. She said her husband told her it was handled, that it was better if she did not ask questions. She admitted she did not press the issue. She told investigators she chose to believe Claire had survived somehow, even as the evidence mounted that she had not. The investigators sat in silence as her words settled over the room. One of them gently reminded her that Claire's blood was found in the service tunnel, that she had not simply walked out. Mrs. Patterson closed her eyes. She did not deny it. She simply said she had nothing to do with the final disposal of the body. Her lawyer interrupted at this point, shutting down further questions, insisting she would only continue under a formal agreement. The investigators left the meeting frustrated, but grimly satisfied. They finally had a partial confession enough to bring the case back to prosecutors with fresh urgency. In Nashville, the district attorney's office debated the risks of filing charges based on her statements. Without a body, the defense could argue Claire had run away. But Mrs. Patterson's own words provided motive, an account of violence, an admission of covering it up. Prosecutors decided it was enough. They announced publicly that they would pursue charges of obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and accessory after the fact. International legal teams prepared extradition paperwork. For the first time in nearly a decade, the possibility of a trial seemed real. Claire's brother received the news late at night, answering the call in the dark kitchen of his apartment. He listened to the prosecutor's careful explanation, the disclaimers about how hard the case would be to win. He sat at the table long after hanging up, staring at the cheap wood grain pattern and thinking of his sister's last moments. He wondered if she was afraid if she called his name. He felt no satisfaction in the news, only the dull ache of knowing her story had been used, denied, and finally confessed in a half-truth that left out the most important detail. Where her body lay, what had become of her after the lights went out in that cavernous old kitchen. The extradition of Mrs. Patterson became the talk of Nashville as soon as the district attorney's office confirmed it was officially underway. News vans lined the courthouse square waiting for statements, while columnists wrote sharp-edged pieces demanding accountability. The old mansion loomed over the city's imagination, its dark windows offering no defense against the accusations that grew louder each day. For Claire's brother, the process moved with agonizing slowness. He kept a battered notebook filled with every official update, every court date penciled in, with cautious hope. At night, he would sit by the window in his small apartment, listening to the city sounds, thinking of the sister who once called him every week to ask about his classes and remind him to eat. He replayed the words of Mrs. Patterson's confession again and again, testing them for sincerity, weighing each pause and deflection. He could not forget that she had admitted to watching Claire fall, but claimed to know nothing more. The local police, under renewed political pressure, went over the mansion once more with their crime scene team. They ripped up floorboards and pried apart walls, searching for anything they had missed. The service tunnel where Claire's blood was found felt like a tomb, the brick walls exhaling mildew and silence in equal measure. Officers lowered lights into every crack, measured and photographed every stain. For all their effort, they found no body. The hidden panel where her ID had rested now gaped open like a wound, a grim reminder of how close she had been to being found all those years earlier. Investigators stood in the kitchen staring at the new appliances installed during renovations, trying to picture the original room. They imagined Claire, standing at the counter with her grocery list focused on dinner preparations, unaware of the storm about to break around her. Prosecutors built their case carefully aware that juries did not like convicting without a body. They focused on Mrs. Patterson's confession, the ledgers that showed motive, the trace blood evidence that refused to be denied. They interviewed old staff members one by one this time, with subpoenas to ensure cooperation. Some told stories that seemed mundane at first, but took on new meaning. A maid described seeing Mr. Patterson in blood-spattered shirt sleeves that night, claiming he told her he cut himself on glass. A gardener remembered the family instructing staff to stay inside the following morning, forbidding anyone from working the grounds. Small details that prosecutors hoped would add weight to their argument that this was no accident, no misunderstanding. As the trial date was set, reporters began publishing retrospectives on Claire's life. Old photos emerged of her in her chef whites, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes bright with determination. Friends spoke of her generosity, how she once cooked an entire Thanksgiving dinner for a neighbor who fell ill. Her brother gave a single interview, his voice cracking, as he described how she used to save scraps from the Patterson table to feed stray cats in the alley behind her apartment. Nashville began to remember her not just as the missing chef, but as a woman with dreams, humor, and stubborn dignity. The public mood turned solemn. Talk radio segments shifted from speculation about money and scandal to arguments about justice and dignity for the dead. Mrs. Patterson eventually stood before a Tennessee judge in a pale gray suit, hair pulled back tightly. Her lawyer spoke for her, often objecting to questions and deflecting accusations, but she could not avoid the cross-examinations entirely. On the stand, she repeated the version she gave in London, insisting she never meant for anyone to be hurt. She described a husband out of control, her own fear, the horror of seeing Claire fall. But she also admitted that she had left the room, that she had chosen to believe it had been handled. She described seeing the service tunnel door ajar the next morning, but doing nothing. The courtroom sat silent as she dabbed at her eyes, listening to the prosecutor hammer home the point that she had chosen reputation over truth, silence over justice. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they convicted her not of murder, but of obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact. The sentencing hearing was quiet, marked by a kind of collective exhaustion. She received prison time, but not enough to satisfy many who believed she bore equal blame for Claire's death. Outside the courthouse, protests formed demanding charges against Mr. Patterson, whose extradition remained bogged down in legal maneuvering overseas. Reporters demanded answers about why the full truth remained out of reach, but prosecutors pointed to the blood in the tunnel, the missing body, the lack of evidence tying him to the final act. The justice system, they admitted, could only do so much. Claire's brother sat in the front row of the courtroom each day, unmoving, watching Mrs. Patterson with eyes that held no forgiveness. After sentencing, he walked out into the bright afternoon and faced a line of cameras and microphones. His voice was calm as he spoke. He said he did not celebrate her conviction. He did not see it as victory. He said he only wanted his sister to be remembered as a woman who deserved to be safe in her workplace, who deserved to be heard when she spoke the truth. He asked anyone listening to remember Claire as a person, not just a name in a headline. Then he walked away, ignoring the shouted questions, vanishing into the city crowds. The mansion eventually sold to a developer who announced plans to turn it into luxury apartments, but permits stalled, contractors hesitated, and rumors of the investigation kept buyers away. The house sat behind its gates, overgrown, and cracked, an unsold property that locals still called cursed. Children rode their bikes past and pointed at the windows, claiming to see shadows move. Teenagers dared each other to stand on the porch at night. But no one stayed long. The property became a landmark of failure, of secrets buried under money and time. Years later, Nashville passed new labor laws in Claire's name, requiring better protections for domestic workers and service staff. Her brother helped lobby for them, quietly attending city council meetings, telling her story to anyone who would listen. The laws did not bring her back, did not locate her body, but they did leave a mark she would have been proud of. People began to say her name with respect instead of pity, recognizing her as someone who had tried to do the right thing in the face of power and threat. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. We would love to hear what you think about the plot in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. Your thoughts help us bring more stories like this to you.